60 Minutes Rewind.
It's been 60 years since Dr. Alexander Fleming discovered a drug called penicillin, the first antibiotic. Since then, doctors have prescribed the drugs to cure everything from pneumonia to scarlet fever. But now scientists are sounding the alarm that we have been overusing antibiotics and that the germs have figured out ways to become resistant to them. Infections we thought we had conquered once and for all are coming back because of a new breed of germs that doctors call superbugs, superbacteria that are resistant to almost all antibiotics. The latest culprit is called MRSA, or MRSA, a staph bacteria that triggers infections so virulent they can and have turned deadly within days.
We're going to finish 14 days of treatment.
The first doctor in the country to identify MRSA in patients that weren't already very sick in the hospital was Dr. Robert Dahm, head of infectious diseases at the University of Chicago Children's Hospital.
What we noticed that was so different was we were seeing perfectly healthy children come in with serious, severe infections, and they were this kind of resistant staph. We said, what's going on here?
What was going on was this new superbug, MRSA, was suddenly causing pneumonias and bone and skin infections so toxic that children were dying because of a lack of an effective antibiotic.
A couple more deep breaths.
If just 2 years ago you had brought your child to the doctor with any of those infections,
they would get an antibiotic that belonged to the penicillin group of antibiotics. We can't do that anymore. We've abandoned that approach.
Totally.
Totally.
You know already it's not going to work.
Right. All of these psyllin, cephalosporin antibiotics gone.
So is this MRSA resistant to every single antibiotic you have, or?
It's not hopeless, but we're needing to resort to unusual and often very, very expensive, hard-to-find new treatments.
This new MRSA seems to be hitting people who are in close physical contact, children in daycare centers, prisoners in jails, and athletes on sports teams.
I got it after the New Orleans game.
2 of the NFL's Miami Dolphins were hospitalized with MRSA last season.
A lot of athletes are playing with cuts in their skin or on AstroTurf, which is like a rug, and can burn abrade your skin.
Right.
Staff love it when we have a break in our skin. They just love it. They say, this is just what I need to get inside.
It's all over the country now.
It's all over the country now. It's all over the world now.
Is it too soon to say it's an epidemic?
Well, I think it kind of is an epidemic.
But even with estimates of over 10,000 cases so far, doctors in many communities aren't recognizing MRSA. That's what happened with 13-year-old Nicholas Johnson of Stafford, Texas. After he was injured at football practice, his parents, Janet and Dale Johnson, took him to the pediatrician.
They diagnosed it at that time as a bad shoulder sprain.
And what did they give him for that?
Well, they just said to put his arm in a sling and take ibuprofen for pain.
That was on Thursday. By Friday night, the Johnsons were in the emergency room at Texas Children's Hospital. Nicholas's temperature had spiked to 104.6.
They gave us some antibiotics and some pain pills. So we took him home. I thought, well, in a couple of days, the antibiotics will start working and he'll start feeling better.
But the antibiotics didn't work. On Monday, when his elbows and knees swelled up, the Johnsons rushed Nicholas back to the hospital.
He was in respiratory failure, and they needed to put him on a ventilator.
You must have just been terrified, to say the least.
To say the least. Actually, at one time we were told that we needed to get family around because he just might make it. It was.
But Nicholas did make it.
These are all my football trophies.
After being given multiple antibiotics, Nicholas was able to fight off the MRSA infection, which had spread through his whole body. The hospital report says it's a miracle he survived. Are you right back to where you were?
My running's not as good as it used to be.
He's also lost all the hearing in his left ear. But otherwise, he's in great shape and loves to show off the scars from his 3 operations. One of the life-saving drugs that Nicholas got was a powerful antibiotic called vancomycin, which for years hospitals reserved as the drug of last resort. But now vancomycin use is skyrocketing. To explain why that's frightening, Dr. Dom showed me Petri dishes with different strains of staph. So each one of these little stickers is a different antibiotic.
That's correct. Now, you can see that around the discs, there's a cleared zone.
Yeah.
That cleared zone is where the bacteria have died.
So those staph germs were killed by various antibiotics. But this Petri dish contains MRSA.
Here you can see there's a very different result. There's no circles around these antibiotic discs.
Except for one.
Except for one, and this is vancomycin. So this strain is resistant to everything except the antibiotic of last resort.
But as vancomycin becomes the antibiotic of first choice, the bugs are learning to defeat it. 2 cases of vancomycin-resistant MRSA have been reported. And Dr. Dom says there would be a major medical crisis if that strain were to spread. Meanwhile, other bacterial diseases like tuberculosis, gonorrhea, and pneumonia are emerging in more dangerous drug-resistant forms. Childhood ear infections are far more difficult to treat. While we can't stop the bacteria from trying to outwit antibiotics, health officials say a dramatic cut in their use could help reverse the tide. That means doctors will have to stop writing and patients will have to stop demanding the 130 million prescriptions for antibiotics that are given out each year, half of them for illnesses like the common cold that the drugs have no effect on.
Antibiotics don't work on viral bugs like colds and the flu.
The U.S. government started a public education campaign last fall with a recommendation for pediatricians and parents.
Let's check the good one first.
No antibiotics for most childhood ear infections.
This one isn't fine.
Even though most of those infections go away on their own, parents may not stand for that.
When your child has an ear infection, they could be very painful. And I can't imagine them not getting an antibiotic to get better. I mean, I don't know where it would go without an antibiotic.
The story will continue after this.
Dr. William Schaffner is head of preventive medicine at Vanderbilt Medical Center in Nashville. Why do you think it's so hard to persuade doctors that they have to be tougher with their tough patients who want antibiotics?
It's easier to say than it is to do, particularly when for a long time you really thought that there would be a new antibiotic down the pike, and if this one doesn't work, we'll just use the next one.
But Schaffner says the next antibiotic may not be just down the pike. A majority of the major pharmaceutical companies are cutting back on antibiotic research or withdrawing altogether.
For example, in the year 2002, something like 400 new pharmaceutical agents were licensed by the FDA, and that year there were no genuinely new antibiotics among them. I mean, that's a striking thing. Last year there were 1 or 2.
Why is this happening? Well, one reason is that antibiotics are usually taken for just about 2 weeks and are therefore not nearly as profitable as drugs people take for years like Lipitor for cholesterol or Viagra.
If I were the CEO of a pharmaceutical firm, I would point out that our research is benefiting the health of the public. A lipid-lowering drug reduces heart attacks. But how can I responsibly invest my shareholders' money, $900 million to create a new antibiotic?
That's what it would take?
Those are the estimates. That's not fair to the shareholders.
It takes almost $1 billion these days to research and test a new drug for FDA approval. The world's largest pharmaceutical company, Pfizer, maker of Lipitor and Viagra, is one of the companies still working to come up with new antibiotics. Dr. Martin Mackay is Pfizer's head of drug research. It's obvious you have the size and the money, the resources, to take what other companies might see as a huge risk.
It's absolutely right. In fact, of 100 ideas that we think of in our laboratories, only one will make it as a medicine. So it's a huge risk.
The company's latest antibiotic, Zyvox, was developed specifically for the treatment of MRSA. But just 4 years after its release, resistance is emerging. You say you've got some new ideas. How long is it likely to take before any one of us can actually have some of these medicines?
When we have an idea for a new medicine, just to get into humans could take 5 years. And then the clinical trials after that can be another 10 years. So this is a 15-year process.
from now.
This is a 15-year process.
So don't hold your breath for a stream of new antibiotics in the near future, even from companies like Pfizer. Does a pharmaceutical company that's making, I don't know, I'm making this figure up, $1 trillion a week on Viagra, whatever it is, do they owe the country something, that there's an obligation that these companies have?
Oh, I don't think there's any more obligation that the companies have to produce new antibiotics than Ford does to produce a small car that's gas efficient.
So what are we going to do?
Well, we need to think outside the box.
Pharmacist, can I help you?
Thinking outside the box could cost the U.S. taxpayer. There are suggestions that the government actually pay the drug companies to develop new antibiotics. Dr. Anthony Fauci, head of the government's Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, says that idea is being taken seriously. I would think that trying to convince the public that we should help the pharmaceutical companies develop a drug is going to be just about as hard to sell as anything.
I think
they are the richest industry we have.
You hit the nail
literally
right on the head. It is no question going to be hard to sell.
One idea is to extend the patents on billion-dollar drugs like Zoloft or Zithromax if those extra profits are plowed back into antibiotic research. But the medical community prefers another solution, one similar to President Bush's proposal called BioShield, which would give the drug companies $6 billion outright to come up with new antitoxins in case of a bioterror attack. Is there any discussion of taking some of that, maybe even just $500 million, and putting it aside for antibiotics?
The answer is no, not that it hasn't been seriously considered.
The doctors we've spoken to are frustrated that you haven't applied the BioShield concept already. They say you've waited too long.
If the BioShield concept is developing incentives for companies to get involved, we definitely should do it.
So what are you waiting for?
Well, we are engaging them right now, I think.
In fact, they've been engaging the drug companies for the last 4 years about developing new antibiotics. No solution has emerged, and infectious disease doctors say we're running out of time.
The antibiotic era is really only 60 years old, but as we get more and more resistance going on, it acts more and more like the pre-antibiotic era. And it's a little bit of a doomsday and over-dramatic message to say, well, we're going back to that. But in many ways we are.